How's it going, everyone? It's Blake here from ChessPathways.com, and in today's openings video, we're going to be talking about the Sicilian Dragon. The Sicilian Dragon is a line black can choose in the Sicilian defense, so that's going to begin with e4, c5, knight f3. Black has several moves here, d6, e6, knight c6, g6. These have all been tried. In the Dragon, black plays d6, and now we get the open Sicilian after d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6 attacking the pawn, knight c3 defending the pawn, and now pawn to g6 is the move that characterizes the Dragon variation of the Sicilian defense. I'll go ahead and put a link down in the description to my video on the Sicilian defense, so if you want more background on these first few moves, you can click on that. But we're going to take this as our starting position. This is the Sicilian Dragon right here. So let's talk about the ideas for both sides. We know that in the open Sicilian, black is often going to want to play on the queen side. They have this semi-open c-file, and putting this bishop on g7 is going to coordinate very well with black's plan to play over there, because it's going to exert a lot of pressure down the long diagonal. Secondly, from a defensive standpoint, this bishop's going to be a great defender of the black king after black castles kingside. From white's perspective, white has, for the time being, a slight space advantage and a slight lead in development, which white almost always gets in the open Sicilian, and they might try to use this to generate an attack. Furthermore, after this bishop comes to g7, sometimes white will try to exchange off this bishop by playing bishop e3, queen d2, and later bishop h6, and if that bishop ever gets exchanged, that's going to leave the dark squares around the black king very vulnerable. Also, the fact that black has played this move g6 could invite white to use this pawn as a target for opening lines up on the king side if black castles kingside and white castles queenside. White could play h4, h5, and try to open the h-file very fast. So now that we've covered the main ideas here, let's get to the moves. White's most ambitious try against the Dragon is the Yugoslav attack, where they're going to implement a lot of these ideas we've been talking about. That's where white plays bishop e3 here, and they're simply trying to castle queenside after queen d2, possibly exchange the bishop off with bishop h6 later on, and then launch a pawn storm here on the king side after black castles. So let's see how the game can go. Bishop g7 is certainly black's main move. That was the reason they played g6. I should mention a6 is sometimes played. Black knows what's coming. They don't want to castle into this attack, and they're trying to combine some ideas here from the Dragon and the Najdorf variations of the Sicilian. Black will probably play bishop g7 soon, but instead of castling, they might try to play for b5 and b4 and bishop b7, trying to put some pressure on the center from afar and leaving their king in the center for now. I wouldn't really consider this a Sicilian Dragon. This is often called the Dragadorf because it's a hybrid of the Dragon and Najdorf, but I did want to make you aware that this option exists. Also, after bishop e3, some players fall for this trap here and play knight to g4, which looks kind of annoying for white to deal with. Black's threatening to double white's pawns here and to trade off this bishop with knight takes e3, and white doesn't really want to move that bishop again, but unfortunately for black, this doesn't work. White would play bishop b5 check, and black is actually losing here. There's nothing black can do to not lose material. Knight c6 doesn't work because white has two attackers on this square. Knight d7 would fall to queen takes g4, and on bishop d7, white can still play queen takes g4 because the bishop's pinned, and white simply won a piece. So after bishop g7, the main move, white wants to play queen d2, but if white played that now, then knight g4 really would be possible because the queen's not eyeing that knight anymore. So white first plays f3, now castles, queen d2, knight c6. Bishop c4 is often played. This is a very active diagonal for this bishop, aiming on this diagonal here, and it also prevents black from playing the freeing move d5 later on. Black can play bishop d7 here. Black just wants to clear the c8 square to bring the rook into the game. White gets castled, rook c8, and now white often plays bishop b3 here preemptively. They just don't want to allow any discoveries here. This rook is eyeing this bishop. So bishop to b3, knight to e5. This is a common way for black to try to get some counterplay here on the queen side. Black wants to bring this knight to c4, forcing white to exchange off this powerful bishop. The pawns could start rolling, the queen could swing out in some lines. But black really has to play very actively because white's plan is simply to play h4, h5, trade off the bishops, and as Bobby Fischer said, sack, sack, mate. Just checkmate the king over here on the king side. As you can probably guess, this line is very sharp, very theoretically demanding, and I would not recommend you play the Sicilian Dragon unless you're ready to study up here and make sure you know your stuff, because it's very easy to get mated if you don't know what you're doing. So after knight e5, white usually plays h4, and now knight c4 is one of black's options, simply going along with their usual plan. And after bishop takes c4, rook takes c4, white can even play h5 here as a pawn sacrifice, not even wasting time playing g4, just trying to open up that h-file right away. Black usually takes this pawn with knight takes h5. If black doesn't take this pawn, white's probably just going to follow up with bishop h6, and then if left to their own devices, white's just going to take on g7, the king will take, then white will open the h-file, play queen h6 with check, followed by knight d5, removing this knight's defense from the h7 pawn. Just to show it, let's say black plays a move here that doesn't do a whole lot, like a6, then we might see bishop h6. Let's say black keeps doing pretty much nothing here on the queen side. They're trying to attack, but it's way too slow. Now we see bishop takes g7, king takes g7, pawn takes, queen h6 check, king f7, and now possibly knight to d5, trying to remove this knight from the defense of the h7 pawn. This line would be considered very bad for black. It's very hard to defend here. Black might have to play rook h8 or something, so black does not want any part of this. So after h5, black can play knight takes h5, and now we see white's idea. White's going to play g4, kick that knight away with tempo, open the h-file, knight f6, and now here comes bishop h6, and white's trying to implement the same idea. So as I've said, if black does not know their stuff here, they're in for some trouble. But thankfully, black has this sacrifice here, knight takes e4, opening up this bishop, threatening something like rook takes d4 to turn the tables, and white is too slow to take on g7 right now because the queen is hanging. So black has won a pawn. White can just play queen e3 though, and now white is once again threatening just to take on g7 and play queen h6, so this demands a strong answer from black. Knight takes c3 would be too slow, but rook takes c3, this exchange sacrifice comes with tempo. If white wants to win material here, they have to take with the b pawn. You can't take with the queen, of course, because of the knight. And after b takes c3, now the white king is starting to look pretty exposed, and this knight can simply retreat back to f6, and there's no more knight d5 deflection ideas either. Again, a very complex line, and this is very typical of the mainline Yugoslav attack here with queenside castling, bishop h6, and the pawn storm against the Sicilian Dragon. There is one key alternative to discuss here. After white plays h4, instead of playing knight c4, black will sometimes play this move h5. This is often called the Soltis variation, and black is simply trying to slow down white's offensive over here on the king side. Here, white will often play bishop to g5. Now this bishop has this outpost here, and this e7 pawn could be a target later on, as we're going to see in one of the main lines, but white is forced to play a little bit slower here than they are after knight c4. The main line goes rook c5. This is just a general multi-purpose move here. It supports a possible b5 advance trying to get to the white king, and it also lifts this rook so black could try to think about doubling or even tripling on this file in some lines. King b1, normal move here to play when you castle queenside, just tucking the king away. b5, g4, and black could accept this pawn sacrifice, but then again, h5 is possibly coming. Black does not usually want to deal with that. They're just going to continue on with a5 and let white take this pawn if they want it. Knight takes h5 can be played, but now white can play knight to d5, and we see that e7 could be a target here. It's kind of hard to kick the bishop away. f6 looks very weakening and blocks the bishop. But that said, black is starting to generate their own play over here on the queen side. Black can simply play rook e8 to defend this pawn, and we're still going to get a very exciting double-edged game. I also want to point out an alternative that white has. If we go all the way back here to move 8, after black plays knight c6, we've looked at playing bishop c4 here. This is the Yugoslav attack, like I've said. But white can sometimes not play this move and just castle long immediately. And this can trip up some players here with black who don't know the lines, because black cannot play the same way now that we saw in the main line. If black tries to play bishop d7, rook c8, knight e5, and knight c4, they're going to be losing a lot of time here, because we have to think about what happened in the main line, right? In the mainline Yugoslav attack with bishop c4, we saw that white played bishop to c4, then bishop to b3 after the rook came to c8, and then took on c4. So white made 3 moves with that bishop. If black tries to play this same way and bring this knight to c4 with the bishop sitting on f1, white's going to be able to exchange off for that knight, only making 1 move with the bishop, and that gives white 2 extra tempos to accelerate their attack here on the king side. Black can certainly not afford that. So black has a couple ways to handle this, but the most principled is probably to play d5 right away. Black has the support here to play this move with the help of the knight and queen, and opening up the center is a good way to make white's flank attacks less effective. This is the main way to take advantage of the fact that this bishop is not on c4, stopping black from making this freeing move. But the lines here are still pretty exciting. I'll just show one of them right now. White often plays king to b1 here, and this move sets a nice little trap. Black cannot take on e4 right now. Go ahead and pause your video if you want to think about what white could play here. But if you're back with me, knight takes c6 would actually win a piece here for white. White has just taken a piece. If black recaptures it, then their queen is hanging. And if black tries to exchange queens first before recapturing, we see that now this move does not come with check, and white can play the in-between move knight takes e7 before taking back the queen, and black is completely lost. So instead, after king b1, black will often just take here on d4, and there's an exciting line here where white does not take back right away. White can play the in-between move e5, and now we sometimes see knight to f5, e takes f6, white gets their piece back, and there's all kinds of craziness here. Black could play e takes f6, and then bishop c5 comes, or there's a line here with bishop takes f6, knight takes d5, and now black has a nice little queen sacrifice. Queen takes d5, queen takes d5, knight takes e3, with a fork here, and black has quite a bit of material here for the sacrificed queen, and these two bishops could be very strong pointed at the white king. So that's one interesting way the game could go here after this line with castles long, instead of the Yugoslav attack with bishop c4. Alright, so that was the Yugoslav attack, and sorry for going through that so fast, but there's obviously a lot of very forcing lines that both players have to know, so many different very sharp lines for both sides, so we're really just able to scratch the surface in this video. So if you want to play the dragon, definitely make sure you know how to handle all of these very dangerous lines. But now let's look at some lines where white does not castle queenside, and we're going to look at the classical dragon here. So after g6 here, white can play bishop e2, bishop g7, and simply castle to the king side. So this is of course a much calmer way to play. This is white's main alternative to a lot of those exciting lines where we castle long, and the game is going to be more positional from here. So black can castle, white's going to finish up development and play bishop e3, knight c6. White will often play knight b3 here. There are plenty of other choices too, but because white has a space advantage, white will often look to avoid exchanges. Bishop e6. Usually you might have been taught that you don't want to block in your central pawns like this, but when you fianchetto the bishop, often you can break this rule. There's no real need for black to move this pawn to finish up their development, and this bishop is pretty well placed here on e6. White often plays here f4, grabbing more space. And black has a few ways to play here. Knight a5 has been tried. I think that's black's second most popular move, either intending knight c4, or if the knight takes, then the queen gets to join the game. But the main move here for black is a really nice plan. Black can play queen to c8, and this move really does two things. Number one, it adds more control here to the g4 square. Black might want to play knight g4 or bishop g4 at some point, depending on what white does. And secondly, it also frees the d8 square for a rook to come to, and so black can try to play this freeing move once again, this pawn break d5 to liberate their position and fight back against white's space advantage. So here white has a nice answer. White should play king h1 here. The reason for this move is that knight g4 would actually be pretty annoying right now. It's hard to see what to do with this bishop. So by playing king h1, white's providing this bishop with an escape square here on g1, and also, the king's just simply safer here on h1. On g1, it's kind of still exposed on this diagonal. Even though the bishop's watching out for it for now, it never hurts to tuck that king a little bit further away. White could play h3 here instead, just to prevent knight g4. There's nothing particularly wrong with this, but it does loosen up the king a little bit, so instead king h1 is the more popular move. So black goes ahead with their plan. They play rook d8. And black's threatening to play d5, and not only would that kind of a break in the center, it might even threaten to play d4 in some cases and fork the knight and bishop, possibly based on some tactics here where this bishop helps out, again depending on what white does. So white often just gets out of the way of this entirely and plays bishop to g1. This bishop still does a good job on this diagonal. There's no reason for it to be exposed here on e3, and now white can meet d5 with e5, maintaining their space advantage. The natural move here for black is knight to e4, just launching that knight forward into this square here on e4. But now white can play bishop d3. White's actually not afraid of these doubled pawns here after knight takes c3. This has sometimes been tried by black, but white actually scores pretty well in this position. After knight takes c3, b takes c3. This looks really bad at first for white. White has these doubled and isolated pawns on an open file here where they can be attacked. But it also lets white play knight to d4 very soon. For example, after bishop f5, knight d4 can be played. And it's actually not so easy to see how black can play here. Black has tried just taking on d4, and here you might think white would fix their pawns with c takes d4, but even bishop takes d4 makes a lot of sense. This bishop's just really restricted now. This bishop, if it ever takes here on d3, white could maybe consider fixing their pawns. They could even take with the queen. And if that were to occur, white could even think about trying to break through with f5 at some point on the king side, probably after bringing their rook to the e-file and preparing that a little bit. It seems pretty hard for black to find a plan here. So often black will not go for this. They will not play knight takes c3. f6 is a more popular alternative, trying to chip away at the white space advantage here and try to open this bishop back up, because it's really being blunted by this pawn on e5. The game might continue e takes f6, e takes f6. Black takes with the pawn because they might want to push this pawn to f5, really cementing this knight in the e4 square and opening the bishop back up. And now white could play knight to b5 and bring this knight to the nice outpost here on d4. We see that this d-pawn is now isolated. Black now does not have a c-pawn or an e-pawn, and we know that that means the square in front of this pawn will be a nice outpost. And we really have a nice positional game here. White has great control of the d4 outpost. We see 3 of their minor pieces are aiming at that square. Meanwhile, all the black pieces look pretty active here, especially after f5 is played, and we're going to get an interesting middle game from here. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. And please make sure you click the link down in the description to visit chesspathways.com and get signed up there. It's totally free to join, only takes 5 seconds, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you sign up. It took me way too long to become a chess master, and I'm hoping to help you do it in a fraction of the time. Thanks, and I'll see you there.